Do you want to hear about the stove? Okay, this is a photograph of the kind of a kitchen stove that all homes had when I was a boy. I believe it was standard equipment for the entire nation. Now, this stove, I already explained a little bit about it, but it should be noted that it performed what is now performed not only by a cook stove but also by the furnace. It heated the whole house. It heated the kitchen, but you opened the doors and I got to heat the rest of the house.
My grandmother used to bake chestnuts in her oven, and they would heat their hot water on here, and some of them had a holding tank for hot water, and they would heat their curling irons there. It was used for everything. It was quite an important thing in our day.
And we heated the water in the stove that you just saw the picture of. You had the water tank was filled. It was called a reservoir, and it was filled with hot water. But from what my wife just said, you can understand that we started the baths with the little children, and then the girls and the women. The last ones taking the bath were the ones that were the biggest and the dirtiest. However, there was always a pitcher of clean water there to pour over you to wash the crud and suds off.
Actually, I think the little kids loved these baths. They were fun.
Okay, when the ice in the river got about 14 or 16 inches thick was when we would go down to cut the ice blocks. We'd take a sleigh and bobsled, and we'd take an ice saw, go down and cut these huge slabs, which we'd haul home in the bobsled. And then we had an ice house where we kept the ice, and we'd stack these big blocks of ice with a little snow or chipped ice in between them and a little water so that we could freeze them all together into one enormous block of ice. And we had sawdust underneath, probably 6 or 8 inches, and around all the sides and on the top. Go ahead.
And then they would chip it off a big hunk of it and bring it in and put it in this ice box. And that was our refrigerator in those days.
This kept the ice frozen when the temperature outside was 90 or 100.
This is a sewing machine they used a little bit before my day, but this you had to turn it by your hand. Later on they had one that had pedals down here, and you'd pedal it with your feet to sew. And I kept one of my mother's for years, but it ran 25 years. They never wore out. They were wonderful sewing machines.
We ate an abundance of potatoes and beans and things like that, food that was highly nutritious and reasonably priced. I remember on one occasion in Mesa, Arizona, my father was complaining about the high price of food, and he picked up a head of lettuce, and he was complaining that you had to pay a nickel to buy that head of lettuce. He thought that was exorbitant, about twice what it was worth. I also remember that in Hewlett, Wyoming, we'd go down to the local store and buy a banana. And in those days, universally, you could buy a banana for 5 cents. And my father was complaining about that. That was an example of the inflation caused by World War I. Before that, you could buy bananas anywhere, two for a nickel.
And a loaf of bread for 5 cents.
When I was about 6, I liked carrots raw, but I didn't like them cooked at all. And my father noted that and explained to me that usually we like things that we developed a liking for by eating them. So he suggested that I, each time cooked carrots were served, that I take 2 or 3 pieces and go on from there. Eventually I love them. I like them today. Well, as far back as I can remember, we always had an organ in the church.
The pianos were the upright. They were made of good solid wood, so they were extremely heavy to move around. My mother had a chickering one that was supposed to be one of the best made in those days. And while I'm talking about that, when my mother, Ina R. Jones, was only 8, she played all the marches for the children to come into school and then to go out for recess, to come back from recess, to go out for lunch, to come back from lunch, to go out to recess, to come back, and to go home at night. From the time she was 8 years old, she played all the marches for the school, and I went to the same school that she went to. When I was little, they had a little glass, kind of a regular kind of a glass, and everybody would take a sip. You'd try to turn it around from the last person. I'm wondering how everybody didn't get sick. And then later, they had little glass cups, and then it was a little more sanitary, but then I don't know how many years later they changed to the paper cups.
I just remember a discussion between my mother and my father concerning this change to this, the old sacrament cups. And I remember them talking about some of the people complaining about it. And that others had said, well, they needed to do that because of bacteria, microbes. But the others said, well, but they had the sacrament prayer, that should have killed the microbes. And others said, well, it may have killed the microbes that were there at that time. Didn't kill the microbes that got in there from the drooping mustaches that got dripped in the water as it went by.
I've never heard of anybody getting sick from it, but who knows, maybe they did.
Where I lived, they didn't have such things as baptismal fonts. And if you wanted to get baptized, you had to get baptized in the river. I think the book that I was impressed with the most was Robinson Crusoe. It had a lot of adventure in it. So my father would read that and we'd all gather around. Of course, there weren't too many of us, just my sister Lucille and me. But we'd gather around while he read the book, Robinson Crusoe. Also, we used to read the Bible, I think probably a lot more than people do today. Today people have all kinds of things. They can go flip a button and watch television, either church movies or other kinds, but there's plenty of entertainment and all it takes is the flip of the switch. Where I spent my time when I was 6 and 7, there were no entertainments. Television hadn't been invented yet. The radio had been invented, and there were some people who had any, who had some, but not very many. So the family did a lot of reading. The other thing we did, we sang a lot of our church songs in the evening, and I loved those. On the scriptures, my father's name was Daniel, my mother's name was Esther. So those were the 2 books that we read the most out of in the Bible. And they're still my favorite books, the book of Daniel, the book of Esther. Well, he was going to have quite a feast for the family, so he bought this 1-gallon can of Loganberries. And to make sure that it was just perfect, he put quite a quantity of sugar in to sweeten them up. But after he already got it all mixed up, he discovered that by mistake he had put in salt. So he had to toss the whole thing out the snowdrift.
My father had been in the hospital and had been quite ill with a hernia operation. And my mother got pneumonia, and all the family were gathered around her because she was unconscious and they expected her to die at any minute. And my father's father was up there, and he said to me, you know, Heavenly Father listens to little children's prayers, and why don't you go in this little room next door and pray and ask your Heavenly Father to bless your mother that she'll live, because you don't want your mother to die. And so I went in the little bedroom right next door and prayed that my mother might live. Well, at the same time as I was praying, there was a man that used to have the gift of healing, and he was out feeding his chickens. It was in the dead of winter and really cold, and he didn't have a jacket on or anything, but he felt so impressed to go up to my grandmother's house that he didn't stop to get anything to keep him warm. And he walked up there and knocked on her door and asked how my dad was. And she said, well, he's a little better, but the one we're concerned about is his wife, because she is unconscious and we're all gathered around waiting for her to pass on. And he said, well, would you like me to administer to her? And she said, well, we've already had her administered to, and I have given my consent to the Lord to take her if he wants to take her. And he said, well, while there's life, there's still hope. So he came in and gave her a blessing. While he had his hands on her head, her eyes started moving, and she started muttering a little bit of words. We couldn't understand her, but she started coming conscious. And before that, they had flashed a flashlight in her eyes and no sign of life. Her fingernails had turned purple, and she hadn't had any sign of life before that. But from that minute on, she started getting better and got over the flu. This gave me a real strong faith that the Lord does hear and answer our prayers. And I believe one time when that was strengthened was this was when I was probably about 9 years old. And when I was a little bit older, I heard the poem, well, the radio was invented. And I heard the poem that said, if radio's slim fingers can pluck a melody from earth's thin air, how much easier it is for God to hear our prayers. And I really believed that. I thought, wow, that's true. He can hear my prayer. If we can hear this music over this little radio that we used to have to punk up by hand. Well, no, that was a phonograph, but we had a little radio, and if that could bring music into my house, I thought that was amazing. And that gave me a lot of faith. But when the television was invented, that even gave me more faith, because then you could see pictures and hear, and the Lord must have instruments and things much more advanced than we have, so I know that our Heavenly Father can hear our prayers and that He does answer them.
As the home teacher, had been very recently, didn't know really anything about the family yet, but the father called to see if I'd come up, and I understood he would say, help give a blessing to his daughter. I was out pouring a cement walk in the backyard, and I was all dirty. And he said, go ahead and clean up, then come on up. So I did. But I didn't realize that his little girl was in so much pain. She was in real pain, had a bad earache. Otherwise, I would have gone right up without waiting to stop and clean up. And when I got up there, I assumed he was an elder and was going to assist in the administration. Turned out he didn't own any priesthood at all. So I had to do the whole thing. So I went ahead and administered. Well, she was what, about 4 or 5, more or less, maybe 6. About 4 or 5. So I went ahead and administered to her. By the time I said amen, she was sleeping soundly. And that just took away all her pain.
And at church, she would hug him. She liked him better than the doctor, because the doctor couldn't get rid of the pain, but he did. And she really was his. Even when she grew up, she remembered that.